Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and WhiteSource. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you missed any of our session or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be sent to you shortly after we conclude our live webinar. If you have any questions, we want you to submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. And you can also use the chat tab on the right side of the screen to engage with your fellow audience members or just let us know your feedback throughout today's webinar. Finally, at the conclusion of this event, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. Our topic for this webinar is Plan and Protect, a modern plan for open source security. And I'm joined today by Seila Pinto, Director of R&D at WhiteSource, and Tommy Falgu, Senior Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. Tommy, Seila, thank you both so much for joining me. I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Cody. So it's really exciting being here. And I would like to start with an introduction. So my name is Seila, and you probably can pronounce it. So Seila goes fine. And I'm director of R&D at WhiteSource. So what does it means to be a director of R&D at WhiteSource? So actually, it's WhiteSource. What we do is it's a security company. We started with open source solution, but now we cover a complete solution. And I'm leading the knowledge group. And what we do in a knowledge group is working nights and days to build and serve the top open source components knowledge base in the industry. And when I say top, I mean that it should be extensive, it should be up to date, it should be reliable, and each one of those features is challenging by itself. Extensive because there are many packages out there. Up to date because it is challenging to use resources and still and be under a budget and still be up to date with all the components. And reliable because to be honest, sometimes it could be really messy out there. So there's a lot of algorithms and heuristic that we have to run in order to keep the data as reliable as possible. And we are enthusiastic about share it with our customers and share it with the community. So we have a public database, a vulnerability center. We love to write our insights. We love to write blog posts, to write interesting reports, and to do webinars, just like this one that we're doing right now. And beside being the director of R&D, I've been around in the industry since 2008, and I like to speak and to run a financial community. I'm a mother, and I authored my own children's book. Now, one last thing that it's really super relevant is that one of my teams in the knowledge group is the security team, WhiteSource security team, um, that is busy around generating and finding unique data. We also find and research 0 days. WhiteSource is a CNA, which means that it's a certified numbering authority. So we issue our own 0 days that we find, and we also find unreported vulnerabilities and all the research of a supply chain attack. So it's one of the fascinating teams. I will talk more extensively during this session. Uh, for you, Tommy.
Hey everyone, my name is Tommy Falgu. I am a cloud solution architect for Microsoft, and I work primarily. I work primarily with independent software vendors, such as WhiteSource, or we sometimes call them ISVs. And I come from 20 years of Unix and Linux development. I have been doing it for telecom companies. I worked at Yahoo for almost 9 years, and I was one of those people that would have never joined Microsoft, but I really saw the contributions and the change of leadership with Satya Nadella and how he's embraced Linux, embraced open source, and really saw that change and said, you know what, I wanted to jump on that. And so I've been been at Microsoft for a little over 5 years now.
Yeah, Tommy, Microsoft is an interesting story. I come from Java. Like I've been a Java
Hmm.
developer since ever. And I remember this debate about Java, which is mostly open source, versus .NET, which is Microsoft, and it's not open source. So Microsoft was like the kind of the edge for not being an open source company. And it's really interesting the pivot that Microsoft actually did, a transformation that it did in the past 10 years or so. So I was really surprised to find out that Microsoft today is one of the top three contributors, the top three companies that contributes to open source, which was really fun fact. And another thing is that there is a great infographic that you can find in YouTube or on the website of Statistics and Data, which examined the transformation and the contribution of the big companies in the past 10 years based on GitHub commits and users. And you can see that Red Hat was always there in the first places. And Microsoft entered this top 10 list only in 2015. And then 2017, she actually got to the top three, and still there. And I think that the maybe the top or the most edgy thing that done, so Microsoft did, is to acquire GitHub, which actually symbolized the entrance of Microsoft to the arena and the contribution to open source since then. So it's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot. Wow, sorry. There was a lot of people that were very dubious whenever we made the offer to purchase GitHub. And again, this is not the Microsoft that we grew up with. That was very closed sourced. There really truly is an embrace of that, and there's a goal to shift a lot of the mindset towards open source. And hey, look, .NET, VS Code, some really great tools, and really empower the developers, because, well, Microsoft has been about that empowering of developer and developer communities.
Right.
Well, would you like to start setting this? Oh, setting the stage, man. I need to get a good cough out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. So, well, as many years as a developer and as a CSA, there's lots of companies I see more and more using software that they didn't write. And there's again, as someone who's used open source development for over 20 years, gosh, again, it's you build on this, and more is uh, kind of, again, you're working with your core competency, and to do that, you have to utilize software that you didn't write, and most of that is coming from open source software.
Right. So it's 2022, and the usage of open source is rising. Um, for instance, we can find in OSSRA reports that 97 of the code base that they researched contained open source. In the Open Source Foundation, there was 77 out of the organization, the research, 77% increased their open source software usage in the organization. You can also find this really interesting research in the Health Net Security. They published this research that say that 96% of the scanned application contained open source component. And the average open source, this is really crazy, that average percentage of open source in the code base grew up this year from 36% on average to 57%, which means almost 60% growth year over year in the ratio of a third party vs first party code. So it's actually suggesting that large companies of application are moving more and more towards open source code than proprietary code. And it actually makes sense because there is, you mentioned the core competency, and right, there is this power of competition. And companies should focus on their competitive advantage. They can do that by focusing on their core competency. I mean, today it's not even legitimate to write your own application server or your own logging server. As an R&D manager, before we start to invent new stuff, the first thing that is moral, that we find moral to do, is to search for existing packages, for existing solutions, and to utilize our budget and our time on a good or in an efficient manner. So let's I mean, the vulnerabilities, are they rising? Do you see that the vulnerabilities are rising, Tommy?
Oh yes, I mean we're getting more and more zero-day vulnerabilities that are coming out, more and more things that aren't just, oh hey, I need to patch this, but really the business needs to stop, focus completely on this issue before we move any further.
Right. So for the question, is using open source is becoming more or less secure? I'm pretty like I'm not really um, you know uh, uh, like I don't have a concrete answer for that. I think that the answer is yes and no, and it's hard to tell. Because Lyon's Trovel's assertion means that given enough eyeballs and all the bugs are shallow. So what it means that, right, we see more and more vulnerabilities. We hear about more and more extreme vulnerabilities, like we had with Log4j, and like we had just later on with the Spring Shell. But the community is growing, so it doesn't necessarily mean that we live in a more risky arena. It actually means that the community is more involved, and as much as there is more people or more researchers that research those components, then those bugs become shallow and those bugs are found. Um, for instance, this vulnerability from Log4j was there a lot of versions before, since 2, and only in the 2.14 it was 2.15 it was fixed. But the reason that it's found, it's not because it's a new vulnerability, it's only because it was researched. Now, the thing that it's worth mentioning that I'm concerned about is that, in contrary to Log4j, where we saw a disclosure policy that went by the book, in a Spring for Shell, we actually saw something new that I really hope it will not become a trend. This vulnerability was leaked. We will talk about it later on in this session, but I hope that the community and the researchers will keep saving those processes, the disclosure policies that eventually protect the community, to protect the usage of open source. We want to respect those disclosure policies to make sure that when a vulnerability disclosed, it will disclose with a fix already, and not just like that in the wild and leave the users unprotected.
So one of the things you were talking about was like, hey, look, all these vulnerabilities are rising. What do we do about it? How do we address it? And one of
Right.
the trends we're seeing out there is around shifting left. And you might have heard that term before, but let's kind of take a moment to tell us what we're talking about here. So when we're talking about shifting left, it's about empowering the developer. And what we're trying to do is, again, empower the developer to find and prevent and fix these types of issues. So this brings, again, the control as close as possible to the left side of that pipeline for delivering software. And in doing that, likewise, we also find that we're able to enable more people to become developers by making that a lot easier way to deploy to production. So we're seeing lots and lots of progress around this, especially around DevOps, around baking it into CI/CD tools, truly about making that pipeline easy to go from nothing to taking your source code and then deploying it into production. Now, I grew up in Louisiana, And so whenever I think of vulnerabilities, I often think about it like preparing for a hurricane. It's not about if the next one's going to hit, but more when. Hurricane Ida hit around August of last year. And you know what? Where I grew up, it's still rebuilding. And so the mindset is often rebuild from that last one that just hit and then prepare for the next one because they, Mother Nature is going to bring another one just as security and vulnerabilities are going to be coming up next. Oh, Kayla, I think we lost
Um,
a quick moment. You still there?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yep,
Can you
we can
see
hear
me
you.
and hear me? And can
Yes.
you see me? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you're totally right about the shifting left. And just before, like we think of how or when to integrate. So it's really important to understand how we integrate security. So today, actually, how do we secure and what are the methodologies that available out there for application security? So just I'll throw some shortcuts. So we have the DAST, the SAS, the IAST, and the SCA. But I'm going to explain over and review each one of them regarding the available solutions. So SAST, when we're talking about SAST, it actually stands for Static Analysis Security Testing. Um, and it means that we have a source and sink and sanitizer, those terms taken from the data flow terminology. So source is the place or the source of the contaminated or the potentially contaminated data that it can come from the outside. The sink is the place that this data can meet our data or our customers' data. And the sanitizer is the piece of code or the function that makes sure that this code that came from outside or the data, the piece that came from outside is actually sanitized. For instance, SQL injection, we would like to make sure that there is no a insert or some execution in our code. So we would use a prepare statement for that. Now, when doing SAST, so we're actually finding those source and the sinks and make sure that there are sanitizers, and each microservice stand by its own. Um, it's a traditional tool. It's really available. WhiteSource also has it. And the thing that maybe the one disadvantage with this is that the runtime configuration is missing because it's taking the code as it is. And there are many, many, many false positives in the traditional solutions. Another methodology is DAST, which is dynamic analysis security testing, or we call it the black box testing. Now, it's assess the app as the application runtime behavior. It's actually run code through the app as a black box. Um, the overhead is low. It usually requires dedicated environment, but it takes very long. And of course, it's less comprehensive because you cannot prove that something is not exist, like a vulnerability does not exist. It does less comprehensive. It's find some evidence for a true issues there. Now there's the IAST, which is kind of interesting. It's interactive analysis security testing, which actually you run your own unit tests, and using instrumentation, you generate more cases on your unit test using like fuzzing. We call this technology, and it learns your app through the unit tests, and then it deduces where your risks are. So again, here it's very similar to the Just, but the runtime configuration here is missing too. And of course, there's the SCA, which is, I'm a little biased about this technology, of course, or this tooling, because this is where I come from, and that's what I did for the past years. And the SCA, well, taking into account that 40 to 60, depends on the company, is open source, then a lot of the vulnerabilities or a lot of the open source becomes a major part of your own code base. So the SCA, the software composition analysis, scans your own open source code and find vulnerabilities there. It's very fast. It alerts for open source vulnerabilities. The good tools will also prioritize and give remediation advices. Um, Here too, sometimes the runtime configuration is missing because it's do static. It scans your code when it's usually static. Uh, and the main thing, maybe the main disadvantage is it's that it's noisy. It's very noisy because you have in your code base a lot of dependencies. Their dependencies has other dependencies, so on and so forth. Dependencies has vulnerabilities because eventually the people who write those dependencies are programmers or humans. Humans make mistakes. There is this thumb rule that on every 5 lines of code there is the, this and not desirable or a bug. Sometimes those bugs are resulting in a security issue. So again, the SCA is noisy, so the prioritization is crucial, and also actionable remediation advice are crucial because if there's one thing that programmers hate is that you throw problems on them. Programs developers here to solve problems, not to find them. Um, so we actually went through over the main application security testing toolings. And we at WhiteSource believe that actually we want, or we think that the industry needs a holistic solution that connecting the dots, that also integrate the vulnerability scanning, the security configuration to actually combine your current security posture. Um, and you talked about the shifting left, right? And what happens in Louisiana and the current landscape of the open source. So, what is the current landscape of the open source? I mentioned that before. I mean, are we good? What is the status in very, very roughly? So, again, to be honest, the feeling is that the threat of being really affected from open source vulnerability is being more and more concrete. I've been here, like in the industry, in white source for 4 years, and we find vulnerabilities and we manage vulnerabilities and we handle them. But Log4j was something like we talked about it. It found out in this vulnerability actually disclosed on December 10th, 2021, and then we said that it's something that happens every uh, like 1 to 10 years, once in a decade, something like that. It never happens so often. But then 2 months later, with Spring Shell, that just happened on the end of March. And actually, Tommy, it's worth mentioning that when we prepared this session and talked about what's going on, we kind of prayed or hoped at least that there won't be something new to pop up just 2 weeks ago in those 2 weeks, right? Because there is this, I don't know, feeling um, of like unstable arena. Um, so that's one thing. Now, again, as Linus said, as more eyeballs, then the bugs are shallow. That's great, but it is worth mentioning the Log4j and the Spring Shell issue. Um, the thing with the Spring Shell, I mean, Log4j, fine. It was an RCE. It was pretty severe. But it released and disclosed with a fix, which made some noise. I mean, of course, it was really crazy for me as a developer and both as a CNA, a software composition analysis provider. But we manage it. Spring was disturbing in a way that it's actually leaked. Okay, it was leaked from the account of a Chinese security researcher who just posted Twitter a tweet, and right after he did that, his account was deleted. I think it's illegal in China to disclose by yourself a vulnerability, and it disrespected completely the disclosure policy. He did not go through any CNA. So it started with rumors that eventually cleared by VMware. which released a patch and then worked to release the fix. And the fix was, of course, for the latest version, just for the latest version. Um, so honestly, I really hope. I mean, there was a huge buzz about it, and as I mentioned before, I really hope that those processes of reporting vulnerabilities and go through the disclosure policy. I mentioned that WhiteSource is a CNA. The security team in my group is working on finding 0 days. And right, sometimes we find things that are really crazy, but we hold ourselves and don't not just publish it. And wait through the disclosure policy and give the maintainer the opportunity to release the fix, because it might be a bureaucracy from one for of one hand, but on the other hand, it's again it protects the community because it lets enough time uh, for the community or for the consumers of those packages to actually upgrade. So that's really important to say and really important for us as a community to emphasize that. So you talked about the shift left approach.
Yeah. So
Um,
one of the things you mentioned, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about is that you've got these vulnerabilities that come out. And in the case of Log4j, well, the vulnerability was disclosed and you've got this fix for it. But you now have vulnerabilities like, again, as you mentioned, Spring for Shell, where the vulnerability was disclosed before the community had a chance to attack. So, or before the community had a chance to work on this. You combine that with things like the transitive dependencies of, hey, look, I know I'm using this package, but I don't really know all the things that this other package is using. And the landscape starts getting really, really complex. It gets really difficult to, how do you protect yourself? How do you manage all this? And again, that's where I think one of the analogies I saw is that it's becoming so, like flying a plane is becoming so complex. It's the instruments, like humans are being involved less and less in flying planes because it's the instruments themselves that are doing it, because it's just become that so complex. And that's where the shift left, we think, really helps bring that that mindset helps bring and helps prepare you for that, because by shifting left you then say, okay, great, we're going to put all of our configuration, our work, and we're going to put all of our source code and all of our infrastructure definitions into our source code, and that way whenever there is a change, we are able to fix this. We can let the pipeline work this out and use the trust in the pipeline, as opposed to trusting, hey, look, now I've done this, who's going to be the one to set this all up and rebuild this infrastructure? Well, again, by automating that and shifting left, that's where that really helps out, because developers, let's face it, we're lazy. We don't want to do work. So what we want to do is take fixes, check them into source code, and kind of wash our hands of it. So as a developer, I loved having automation set up. So I trusted my automation. I would check in my changes, and it was actually kind of a joy to watch that automation go through. So
right. You're
when we're,
totally
yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
So you're totally right. I mean, developers um, do and the whole pipeline was changing, the technology was changing. I think that the power that moves it all is the need for speed, right? That's why we love DevOps, that's why we love CI/CD. We
Mhm.
need for speed. And how security fits in, and when you're saying shifting left, I think there are two questions that should be asked. So question number one is, who owns security? Really, who owns security in the organization? And question number two is, when or on what stage should we integrate the security? So for the who owns security, yeah, we know this a trio of this DevSecOps. So developer, security, and the ops. So who owns it? So let me ask you this. So who have the access to the images when we want to upgrade or to patch image? Who patches the application? What can you do when a vulnerability is found? And maybe the question of how many, like how many developers are they that keep producing more and more code? how many DevOps, probably fewer than developers, how many CISOs, probably even fewer than that. So it can't be CISOs and DevOps by itself. It actually requires shared ownership with developers. So that's the thing of shifting left. One of the things, like one of the powers that actually really requires the shifting left. Now, the other thing, the other aspect is how left really can we shift? You have a massive experience in cloud, in a cloud native, and containers, and so on and so forth. So, you know what? Just like 2 months ago, I participated this session in the Cybersecurity Expo in London. I participated this session called "Riding the Waves," navigating the stormiest water of the open source security. Really recommended. If you want it, you can go and educate yourself and listen to that. And I talked there about controlling your process, okay? And actually, compared this when to integrate, on what point to integrate the security to a ship or to the depth of the water. So if a ship is in the deep water and there's a storm in the deep water compared to production or to pre-production, then it's harder to control, right? We saw that in Log4j, some innocent CVE ended up in the most serious security breach ever in the last decade. Countless servers are vulnerable. I'm like reading from the newspaper, the Washington Post, and it was a thing, and it was really hard to mitigate. Right, we had to go and mitigate it to configure the WAF, to change the log4j configuration. And even then, it was not really clear if we're okay, if we're not okay. If we could do it in advanced, that's what we're saying in a shifting left paradigm to make it closer to the developer environment. It could go right. It could go easier. Just one case study of one of our customer told us that all affected libraries updated within 12 hours, and they knew. After that, they knew that they're completely safe and there was no breach. So in the shifting left, we want to push the security integration to the more shallow water, not this ship in the depth of the ocean, rather a surfer on the shallow waves can navigate really quickly, and if you fall, it's not very painful. Uh, but one disclaimer, not to left. Now, what is not to left mean? And here I would like to relate to this new world that we're getting into, that you, Tom, you're already an expert with, which is the cloud native and container world. And to understand why we can't go too left or what is too left in container world, we first have to understand or ask ourselves what goes into a container image. Okay, so what goes into a container image? So we start with the base operation system layer. It could be your the Alpine, Ubuntu, Red Hat. Depends how extreme you are and what is your flavor. Then you have the runtime language dependency like the JVM. And then you have the third-party libraries. Again, depends on what the language that you prefer, npm or uh, Python or Go or Java, and all of that is other people code. Okay, and only after that you have your own code and your own config. So again, when you're building your container and the layers in the image, there are many other layers. There is contextual risk and configurations and other parameters that will eventually determine that will actually affect on your security posture. So there's a new player in the hood, and we call it the context. And the context matter. especially if we remember what we said before about SCA, the software composition analysis, that it is very noisy. There is no way that an organization can take care of all the vulnerabilities issue. Prioritization is the key. So it's really important that we spend our time and invest our time on fixing the actual risks and not the theoretic risks. Just an example, you can look at CVE 2017 10685, okay, which has one of the highest CVSS scores, which is a 9.8. But if we go and check it specifically in Ubuntu advisory, we see that the risk is actually negligible. There's only 2.5% of the vulnerabilities that have actual risk for, or actually found that actually has exploit risk in the wild. So here again, the prioritization is the key, and the content is not always enough. We also need, or at least strive or see how we can take into account the context. So to sum it up, to understand and to get the holistic view of our security posture, it's really important to understand the context and the content, and to do it, of course, proactively and efficiently.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And so one of the things about going towards this shift left approach is we're trying to think of it. Sayla was talking about how far left we want to go, and another thing to think about is what are the things we want to try to shift left. And of course, one of them is the build pipeline, being able to use our continuous integration and continuous delivery (CI/CD) processes to detect these issues early and resolve them early, so that we can get these fixes into production. When I work with some other ISVs, I like to ask them, how quickly are you able to go from I've got a code fix to this is now deployed? And that, I don't really care what the answer is as much as I like to see how they start thinking about this, of like, well, what do we do here? What does it happen here? And that's then an opportunity to discuss with them what are some different areas that we need to focus on. One of the other things is to secure the infrastructure. It used to be that just the application was in source code, but now we're seeing a lot more of this infrastructure as code. Azure Resource, Azure Resource Manager, which is in the form of a JSON. We've got Terraform data and CloudFormation as well. All this is kind of codified and being able to be stored in the source code as the source of truth for what the compute and networking and all the infrastructure requirements look like. And this is great because now if there's a fix, hey, look, we realize that this port is open, we shouldn't have it. Well, we can change that in the source code, let our pipeline go through and deploy that and fix that. And then we also have, as a result, this version history of this is what was changed then, and that allows us to do a lot of really interesting data to make sure that we know that all the controls of who can make these changes are followed. Another thing that whenever you're shifting left is to secure the workload itself. And this is kind of what Sayla was talking about earlier, which is where you have, if you're dealing with containers, you've got the image that you're layering this on top of, and then all the other packages you might be working. This would be protecting the virtual machine as well. If you're running your workload on top of VMs, on top of Ubuntu, what version of Ubuntu are you working off of? And securing that workload as well. Sayla, want to talk more about the control and on this side?
Yeah. So it's like a proactive and reactive approach. That like so it's like a proactive and reactive approach.
Oh, I think we might have a bit of audio.
Yeah. Cody, can you make sure it's fixed?
Yes, we're good to go now.
Oh,
Cool.
okay. Thanks. Um, so it's like having a proactive and reactive approach. Um, so the two cases that we examined here, I think that they emphasize two lessons. In the Log4j, the challenge there was to understanding the risk. Um, you mentioned that, Tommy, about the transitive dependencies and the methodologies that exist there. So it's actually about understanding the risk and to know your dependencies, to be prepared proactively, right? To have to understand what is the direct message, the direct dependencies, but also what is the indirect dependencies. So that was the challenge there. However, with Spring for Shell, I think the lesson was harder, um, because I can share that a lot of my friends or from testimonials out there, the upgrading the Spring Boots to the latest version, it was extremely painful. I know I heard evidence that are still not related to us, of course, that are still struggling with that, with this upgrade. Many features were down, circular dependencies that were not supported anymore. Um, you don't want to do it under fire. And something like that will happen. I mean, there always be something. And I think that the lesson from there is to maintain your app on a regular basis to reduce the technical debt. Just to use the latest major version all the time. Um, Fun fact, Tommy, did you know that in NPM, 90.7% of NPM vulnerabilities are released with a fixed, means they fixed before they published? Did you know? Isn't it amazing?
All right.
So it's actually, again, it's really strengthened the assertion that keeping your code with the latest version is the best strategy. And we saw again with Spring Shell that if something breaks out, that if something it's cheating and break the disclosure policy, you'll be ready, because VMware eventually they fix the latest one. They can't go all over the previous or supported versions. They just fix the latest one, and that's, I think, something companies should plan. I mean, we did it. We took it as an action item to make sure that we fix our components all the time to the latest one. And again, if you're doing small increments, then the breaks will be more gentle. Um, you know what? This taking me back to the big hack of 2017. And if you not remember, or you were not around when it happened, so I'm talking about Equifax thing, or how four Chinese hackers actually took down Equifax. So what happened there? Well, it was 2017. It was like 5 years ago. Maybe the awareness was different, but I think they got a huge lesson there. Um, so Equifax used Apache struts. It can happen to everyone, to Spring, to Apache, to Log4j. Apache here strikes back again. So there was a bug in Apache struts that actually caused an RCE there too, a remote code execution. So they released the vulnerability. Apache released the vulnerability and also released a patch to fix it. And Equifax did not. They ignored them. They ignored the vulnerability and ignored the fix. So 2 months later, on May 13, they found evidence of hackers that already had access and ran queries on their DBs. Eventually, almost 150 million uh, sensitive data of sensitive people, American, stolen, just because of not upgrading vulnerable packages on time. So the lesson: upgrade your dependencies all the time. So the good news is that there are proactive solutions to keep our code in shape. There are tools that doing that. even supply chain attack. We will maybe if we have time, we'll talk about it more extensively later. The bad news, as you said, it's not always enough, right? Take Log4j, where we had to react, or Spring4Shell, we had to react. Then something will happen. We cannot prepare all the time in advance. So we do have to be reactive and take a reactive approach. Like you mentioned, Tommy.
Yeah. So you gave us some really great examples of how to be proactive, how to set yourself up for success. Because as they say, the best defense is a good offense, making sure that you're ready and prepared for whenever this happens. But just as dealing with a fire, um, you want to make sure that again your house is safe, your house is you've got fire extinguishers available. Well, what happens if and when a fire breaks out? That's where doing all of that work, doing all of that preparation work, being proactive really helps. But again, now you're in fire mode. You've got to fight this. You've got to protect yourself because the alarms are going off, and you need to make sure that you're ready to remediate for this issue because now a vulnerability, we'll say a vulnerability has been exposed, and maybe you're in the middle of it. Maybe you are vulnerable. You don't know. So again, you're now in this reactive mode, and you can't anticipate the next time this vulnerability will come up. As we were talking earlier, the original intent for this webinar was going to be focusing around Log4j. Well, guess what? There's another one. But what you can do is manage how quickly you're able to react using, again, DevOps processes. So having the right tools in place will help you minimize that damage, making sure you've got that CI/CD pipeline. Hey, how quickly can you go from a change that you've made in code to your production? How quickly can you close a port through your automated processes? How quickly can you update your web application firewall rules to rule out some of the Log4j exploits that were coming in? One of the ways that we see a lot of traction in is around the cloud native ecosystem. Now, cloud native there's a lot of words to describe cloud native. Kubernetes is one of the ones that is most popular, but it's not necessarily only Kubernetes, but it is one of the ones that has gotten a lot of the attention. And the cloud native ecosystem has made it easier and quicker to react to incidents. One of the ways is because of the mindset around pets versus cattle. And that is the way of thinking of, hey, look, I've got my application. I want to take care of it. I've got my pet. In fact, I've got my pet who's kind of roaming around right now. And I want to make sure that they're protected and that nothing happens to them. And that's one way of treating your application, your infrastructure. The other way is thinking of them as cattle. Well, I'm in Texas, living in Texas now. There's a good bit of cattle around here. And one of the things is you don't really have names for them. You don't have to protect them as much because, well, they're a bit more ephemeral. So if there is a process or if there's a problem in your application, rather than trying to protect it and make sure that, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? How do I do this? With the cloud native mindset, it's these processes again are more ephemeral. So you just kill the process, restart it, and hopefully you have a redundant one, and that making that resiliency easier. Now, again, part of that ecosystem is the tooling. There's lots of open source monitoring. There's lots of tooling around shifting left. Open source CI/CD tools, GitHub Actions. There's been, again, so much proliferation around, hey, look, how can we, again, empower that developer to make their lives easier and, again, create more developers out of the process.
Right. So let's wrap it up. I think that the main takeaways here is, first of all, to be well prepared. Um, if we are well prepared in advance, proactively, then we can manage our reaction better. We want to use tools to set our security posture, content, and context. And we want to eliminate the technical depth and upgrade our dependencies. So all that is great, and you can do it in a sunny day where we can control, where we have control on our code or on our code base. Then, when it's a rainy day and we found out about vulnerability that we're not protected, then we have to react. We have to react quickly, and we have to leverage the tools and processes from open source community and react faster.
Awesome. Well, one of the things before we close out, I do see that there are some great questions in the Q&A. One of which was from our buddy Cody here. How does WhiteSource integrate with GitHub? Silly, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, wow, that's a big question. Because we have the Renovate bot and the White Source Bolt, but all of the above are GitHub apps, which is easy to onboard. But besides that, all the solutions are integrating White Source capabilities into GitHub flows. Pull requests and issues basically allows developers to get White Source benefits without having core UI access. Renovate bot keeps your dependency up to date via pull request. Bolt is the free version of white source for github.com, which automatically runs scans behind the scene and creates issue as vulnerabilities or licenses policies violations, and create a pull request to fix vulnerabilities. And it's also the good part that it's also upload all the data to our core, in which provide eventually visibility and reporting tools to the actual core users. I can say now that there are also detectors that was also for Spring, for Log4j, and specifically for Spring for Shell, that's available in GitHub for free, that you can go and download it and make sure that you're protected specifically from those dependencies.
Cool.
Do you
And
think
someone's
it
also
answered the question?
yeah, I think so. Yeah. Someone was also asking how they can, as a business, collaborate with WhiteSource. I think that's a very interesting one, kind of open ended there. Do you have any contacts you might want to throw a link to, or
Um,
maybe I don't know if they can reach out to you on social media on LinkedIn?
yeah, I'm available on LinkedIn. Cela Pinto is my last name. And I do want to leave some times because we're really out of time. Maybe, I mean, I'm surprised that there was no question about supply chain attack, Tommy, or
So
there is something hidden.
there was one. Someone's asking about. Can you touch on the open source vulnerability management and 0 days and SBOM linkage or synergies? So while not supply chain, well, sorry, it is supply chain there. A little bit different than where we were looking at. One of the things about supply chain attacks is that the White House, this has gathered attention of the White House. There is an executive order around this, around supply chain security. And well, the SolarWinds attack showed how sneaky some of these attackers have gotten. Bad actors are able to infiltrate and add malicious packages. So the SBOM, software bill of materials, as it's mentioned in the chat or in the Q&A, that is a really, really important way of making sure that you know what is getting deployed out there. And gosh, I'm trying to. This is kind of where SCA and software composition analysis is really important to identify
Yeah.
what these libraries and source codes are coming from.
Yeah, it's actually a bit different from the classic SEA or vulnerabilities. It's not exactly vulnerabilities. There is this debate whether a supply chain attack or a malicious package is a vulnerability, and I would love to explain about it because I think it's one of the most fascinating things that happens right now in so many aspects. And if we want to have time to complete it, so really you're all welcome to see the resources. Just today we published some fascinating blog about how attackers actually took over AWS package and turned it like an inactive AWS package and turned it inactive. You might be using it, so you better go and read this blog and make sure that you're not using it, because again, it's really fascinating. And our solution is that we're building the maturity. So first of all, what is it? What is a supply chain attack? So it's taken from more of the traditional industry terminology, that you don't attack the factory itself or the product itself. You can also attack the supply, like you can burn your barns, but you also burn the wheat on the way. So it's part of having and making damage, and not like on a collateral damage. And we use it for the open source or the SCA when we're talking about a bad intention or malware intention of attacking some dependency, potential dependency, like an open source dependency, to harm you or the application as the consumer of this dependency. So the difference is the intention. Okay, the intention is different. It's not an innocent developer that that commit a bug like all of us do. It's someone with intention to attack or to extract data from users that use this package. And how WhiteSource is related. So we are related. We have Defend, which is our product that actually secure Ruby gems. If you go to Ruby gems and you see secured by WhiteSource, is that we scan every package that upload to Ruby, and we classify them to understand if it's malicious or not. And when it's malicious, so we mostly find it, and if it's not, then we mostly release it. And now we also secure NPM, and we have more plans to secure more repositories. Now, as I said, malicious, it could go, there is a wide spectrum of how malicious. So there is a really malicious, like happened today with AWS, or what happened 2 years ago with Copay. Um, there is data extraction, some packages that are uploaded just to extract data of the policy of NPM or the policy of Ruby gems. There is what happened with colors. It was again a really interesting story about a guy that gave his life to the community and couldn't really pay the bills eventually. So he got pissed on the system and added this denial of service piece of code that generated this. And now we can see with everything that happened in Russia and Ukraine, a protest where some packages that there is this story of a package that identified Russian a host, and then turned all the files in the file system to hearts and flowers. It called it a peace and love. Or other protests where is it good? Is it bad? Is it worth discussion? I don't know. It's actually worth discussion, I believe, if it's legitimate protest through open source packages. I think it's really fascinating. It's really worth reading and expanding the knowledge about this area, especially what happened today. And again, we can keep talking about a supply chain attack. Currently, WhiteSource do have the solution of securing the Ruby and the NPM, and we have Defend, which is our product. And it's something that, again, worth expanding knowledge about. We don't know where it's actually going this direction. Yeah, and that's what I had to say about the supply chain attack.
Got it. One other thing is someone was asking about, actually, I think they posted in the chat, which program language is the most secured? Gosh, that's a really vague question, because it's hard to say which programming language is more secure, because vulnerabilities are always coming out, and it's very often not the language itself. I used to be a PHP developer, so I know a lot of that political side. it's often the libraries. So let's go back to our original statement about most of the software that we are writing right now is written based upon other people's libraries, other people's code, other people's languages. So in my experience, it's less of the language itself being a vulnerability as the libraries. And this is, again, why it's so important to make sure you're kept up to date with libraries, that you're able to deploy quickly, and that you're able to resolve these issues as they come up quicker, as opposed to trying to say, hey, look, let me find the most secure thing. No, assume that there's already going to be a security breach. How do you remediate around that?
Yeah, I think it's really, really good notion, because what is more secure? Is it something that there was no vulnerabilities found at all, or something that finds vulnerabilities all the time? I think it's tricky. We do have this report called the most secure languages that go through the trends in each language. You mentioned PHP, and it was funny to find out that PHP is the language with the most SQL injection vulnerabilities in other.
Not surprising.
We had some creative explanation for that. We can take it offline and see and have your opinion if we got it right. Yeah, but that's a good question. Which one is more secure? Well, we can say that the one that we see the most vulnerabilities, or it's probably C, and it's probably Linux. Is it means that Linux is less secure, or it means that, like Lion Trouble's assertion, that there are many eyeballs on it, and then all the bugs are shallow? So that's a good question, and I think, like, my personal opinion is that as long as there is a community around it, and again, maybe I want to strengthen your statement, Tommy, that you have a support after that, assuming something is there. So after something is found and there is a fix, and there would be a fix, and it's been taken seriously. So that's probably the most important aspect, and the tools, of course, around it that can allow you um, to react fast.
Awesome. Cody, I think we're at about time. Want to come bring us home?
Absolutely. So I am seeing we do have a few more questions in the Q&A box. We're going to make sure that Sayla and Tommy do
Cody's
get a couple.
connecting. Maybe
Oh,
the
yep, good.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, man.
Awesome. So I do see that we do have a couple more questions in the Q&A box. We are going to make sure that Sayla and Tommy get a copy of those, so they can hopefully reach back out to you and get your questions answered after the fact. But we do appreciate you sending in those questions. I see that we got quite a few. So again, Sayla and Tommy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this webinar, you should receive an email with a link to access the on-demand recording. You can also find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. We do have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Grace P. Our second winner is Adam S. Our third winner is Tarek G. And our fourth and final winner is Johnny D. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. I would like to thank WhiteSource for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks, as always, goes to you, our audience. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. We ask for just one extra moment for you to fill out a quick post-webinar survey, but otherwise, we do hope to see you at a future Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day. And Sayla, Tommy, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thank you.